here is the talky bit. Now, I want to start off just covering a few general things, starting with the point from the answery bit. Where do you start? Well, when you're choosing a lens for a camera, and that applies to a camera as well, but we're not going into that here, the starting point is always to decide what you want to photograph. And if you're not sure, a general purpose lens is a great place to start. If you want to photograph the details in flowers, a macro lens is for you. If you want to photograph motorsport, a telephoto lens is a must. Now, I will qualify those statements later on, okay? But the point here is, start with what you want to take photos of. Now, I'm going to take a massive leap here. I'm going to assume that you, dear listener, will be aligned with me to a degree, and that you'll be thinking of zoom lenses, which are all I use these days. I covered this in the last episode, but as a quick reminder, a zoom lens has a variable focal length, such as a 24 to 105mm lens. A prime lens, a non-zoom lens if you like, it's got a fixed focal length, such as a 50mm lens. Okay, so I used to have some fixed lenses. I've always used zoom lenses. Well, I've always used zoom lenses with my digital photography, and that's all I have now. So I'm going to work on the basis that you're in the same boat as me. But before I do that, there's some things I need to pick up, which I covered in the last episode, but they are relevant to what I'm going to talk about shortly. The first one's focal length. As a reminder, a 50mm focal length on a full-frame camera, it gives a similar field of view to that which we see with our own eyes. A lens with a focal length of less than 50mm, as in a smaller number than 50, that gives a wider field of view and is called a wide-angle lens. Makes sense, doesn't it? A lens with a focal length larger than 50mm, as in a larger number, that has a narrower field of view. And that lens is unhelpfully called a telephoto lens. I know, wide angle makes sense, telephoto, not as much. A 50mm focal length on a full frame camera, it gives a horizontal field of view of about 40 degrees. Now, popular focal lengths for lenses, they're within the, 24 to 200mm range. A 24mm focal length lens is a wide angle lens, and that gives a field of view of around 73 degrees. A lens with a 200mm focal length is a telephoto lens, and you'll get a field of view of around 10 degrees. So 50mm lens, 40 degree field of view, 24mm lens, 73 degree field of view, and a 200mm focal length, about 10 degrees. Now I say about because there's decimal points, but I'm not going into that detail here. I'm trying to just explain the differences. Now, you can get lenses with smaller focal lengths than 24mm, which are even wider. And you can get lenses with larger focal lengths than 200mm, which give you even narrower fields of view. I could talk about focal lengths forever, but I've got a different plan, which I'll get onto. Next thing I want to just pick up quickly, crop factor. I'm sorry, I have to mention crop factor. I really am sorry. If I didn't have to do this, I'd be happy, you'd be happy. But I have to. 50mm on a full frame camera is a standard lens. To get the same field of view, as in the same view as a 50mm lens on a full frame camera, with a crop sensor camera, you need a focal length of 31 to 33-ish millimeters. And with a micro four thirds camera, a 25mm focal length gives you the same field of view as a 50mm lens on a full frame camera. I know. 24mm on a crop sensor camera, it gives you 36mm-ish. But to get the same field of view as a full frame 24mm lens, you need a 16mm-ish focal length on a crop sensor camera. And that's not great. I mean, it is what it is, but when you look at the telephoto end of things, you've got the crop factor which you multiply by the focal length to give you the effective focal length. So 200mm focal length on a crop sensor camera, that gives you 300 to 320mm, which to some is a good thing. And even better, with a micro four thirds camera, A 200mm focal length gives you an effective focal length of 400mm, and that is quite significant. And if you're using telephoto lenses a lot, crop sensor cameras, and indeed micro four thirds cameras, they should be a consideration for you. Right, maximum aperture. The maximum aperture is the size of the opening in the lens. The smaller the number, the larger the maximum aperture, and the more light that gets through to the camera sensor. And the bigger, heavier, more expensive, and generally bulky the lens probably is. Okay, that's the fundamentals. Now, I've been thinking about how I'm going to explain this. How am I going to explain to you how lenses can help you to take better photos? So rather than trying to go through all of these variables, I'm going to give you a very, very practical example. And that example, it's me. Well, what's not to love, eh? So what do? Well, I use a full-frame Canon 6D with a Canon 17 to 40mm f4L lens. Now, that's a full-frame camera with a professional quality lens. Sounds expensive, doesn't it? You can buy a used Canon 6D for, well, hopefully less than you might think. So what I've done is I've had a quick look on the internet and I found loads of Canon 6Ds in a good condition, as in they're used, but they're in a good condition. Everything works. They might have some cosmetic marks, but do we care about that? I don't anyway. And you can get one for about 400 quid or $400 or I guess 400 euros. Not done the conversions recently. And the lens, the 17 to 40mm lens, 750 quid, $750, 750 euros. I'm going to stop doing that because that's just me blatantly trying to appeal to everybody, isn't it? I'm going to stick to pounds. Hope nobody's offended by that. So 750 quid for a brand new Canon lens, a professional standard lens. It's part of the L series lens. L stands for luxury, would you believe? Yes, it does. Now, I know £750 is a lot of money. I know that. I'm not saying it's not. And I know that £400 for a camera body is a lot of money. But it's a lot less than buying the brand new equivalent. So, yes, £1,150 for the two. I know it's a lot of money. But if you're serious about your photography, you're going to have to invest in some decent gear at some point. Not saying now, but at some point you'll need to, okay? Now, I've also got a Canon 24 to 105mm lens and a Canon 70 to 200mm lens, and I'll come back to these. I've only got 3 lenses for my Canon system. That's it. I use the 17 to 40mm lens for, I don't know, 95% of my photos, and I probably take 80 to 90% of these photos using the 17mm focal length. So much so that I sometimes gaffer tape the zoom ring so that it stays at 17mm, so I get the best value out of the lens, because that's the bit that I need, want and value and like. So 17mm for me. I could use a 17mm prime lens, couldn't I, really? No, 17mm works for me. I know what I'm doing, and I know that this focal length works for me and what I'm taking photographs of. And I am a great example of knowing what you're photographing and what you need to do to help you to do this. Knowing which lenses can help you, or in this case me, take the photos I need to. Now, 17mm focal length, it gives me a 93-degree horizontal field of view. That is wide. I guess it's into the ultra-wide range. It's wide enough to capture interior spaces without exaggerating them, which is very important to me. If I go any wider than 17mm, there's a risk of me making spaces look bigger than they are. But if I use a focal length of more than 17mm, I risk not fitting an interior space into a single photo. So 17mm works for me and for what I do. On a shoot, I'll leave the other lenses in the car. I take my camera on the tripod with a 17 to 40mm lens on it and a few bits in my backpack. I'll leave the rest in the car. They're there if I need them, but I probably won't. Let's remember, I take photos of buildings, that's interiors and exteriors, and the 17 to 40 lens gives me what I need. It works for me. The lens has got a maximum aperture of f4. Lenses with larger maximum apertures let more light in, which allows you to use faster shutter speeds, and it allows you to take photos in lower light handheld. Okay, so the f4 maximum aperture, I need to just explain some things on this one. Canon doesn't make an f2.8 version of a lens, so I need to look at the closest lens to this, which is the 16 to 35mm lens. It's a definite contender for me. If I break the 17 to 40 lens and I'm looking to replace it, I might go to the 16 to 35 lens. And in the Canon system, you've got an f2.8 maximum aperture and an f4 version. Right, so what's the difference? Well, they're both L-series lenses. They're both professional quality lenses. The f2.8 version, it costs about £1,150. The Mark II version is only 750 quid, which is looking good. And the f4 version, it costs around £860. Now, that's not too bad for professional quality lenses. So what about the weight? This is the other thing we need to know about, isn't it? The 2.8 lens weighs 790 grams. The f4 version, 620 grams. Now, that's not a huge difference, granted, but you get the point. I didn't do the sizes here, but it's smaller. The f4 lens is smaller than the f2.8. If you look at other lenses, such as the 28 to 70 f2.8 against the f4 version, and other lenses, you'll see that things get bigger. And on telephoto lenses, things are already bigger, so you just compound that by making them even bigger. To be honest with you, that's not giving me the demonstration of the difference that I was hoping for. It's not a lot, but I do know people who struggle with the weight of photography gear, so it is a serious consideration. It really is. But the point for me is this. I don't need a lens with a larger maximum aperture. I take my photos from a camera on a tripod, and I'm photographing buildings and they're not moving, so f4 is fine for me. I do not need f2.8. Do not buy a more expensive lens with a larger maximum aperture if you don't need it, unless you want to, of course. And yeah, I am looking at the 16 to 35mm lens and thinking about how nice it would be. I've had a look at it and gone, oh, that's not bad. Yeah, I need to stop it. This can be a problem. It's been a problem to me in the past, as you'll find out. I call it shiny newness syndrome. Other people call it GAS, which is gear acquisition syndrome. Yes, really. Okay, I also like taking landscape photos. For my landscape photos, I like to use my Canon 17 to 40mm lens. See, I like wide-angle photos, but when I'm photographing buildings, I don't want to go too wide, as things can begin to look unnatural. But with landscape photography, you can go much wider indeed. And this is where I would dearly love more gear acquisition syndrome here. The Canon 11 to 24mm lens. 11mm focal length. It gives you an impressive, wait for this one, this is good, 117-degree field of view. And I could really use that on my landscape photography. But I'd never use 11mm for photos of buildings. If I used 11mm, I'd be making interior spaces look much larger. Larger. I need to tell you now that it's 11:40 in the morning and I'm thinking of lager already. Quite a concern, isn't it? No, if I used the 11mm focal length photographing interiors, they'd be too big. They'd look too big. They'd look artificial. They wouldn't be realistic. Now, for some people, that won't be a problem, but for me, it's an absolute no. I take photographs of buildings for architects, so I need to replicate the spaces accurately, and the same applies to real estate photography. We've all seen those photos where a tiny room looks massive. That's no use to anybody. If I was photographing buildings for fun, that'd be fine, but I'm not. And this is the point. You use the lenses that work for what you're doing. Going back to the landscape photography, I take my landscape photos with my camera on a tripod, so maximum aperture lens doesn't really interest me. And just so we're clear, I enjoy taking photographs with my camera on a tripod. I prefer taking photographs with my camera on a tripod than handheld. And I prefer taking photos handheld with my camera than I do taking photos with my phone. Just saying. Another thing on landscape photography, sorry, this isn't in my script. This has just popped into my head now. With landscape photography, you can be more dramatic, you can get funkier angles. And when you go wide, like 11mm, that's ultra wide, you can get really close to things. You can get completely different compositions, different results from photos. It's a lot more creative. Not that what I do isn't creative, but what I do is a bit more functional. Landscape photography, where you got more license, you can use these focal lengths and they can really transform photos. As to the other lenses I have, I bought the Canon 6D with a 24 to 105mm lens. Now, this is a great general lens. It's a really great general lens. It's a great lens to start with too. 24mm, it's a really good wide-angle focal length. 105mm, it's a mild telephoto length, granted, but it's still telephoto. But it's the range that's good. Now, I used this when I was starting out with full-frame cameras. I had to correct that because I forgot about the bit before the Canon 5D. This is how I started off with a full-frame camera, and I found I was taking more photos with the 24mm end of things, partly because of what I was photographing, but partly because of the results I was getting. And that led me naturally to the 17 to 40mm lens. Now, on rare occasions when I'm walking around a place with my Canon 6D, more on why not in a minute, I'll use the 24 to 105mm lens. And there's my third lens, which is the 70 to 200 f4L lens. It's another great lens. It really is a great lens, and it's not that expensive. It's a brilliant telephoto lens. I used to use it quite a lot, but I can't remember when I last used it. I'll use it every now and then if I want to get a detail of something, but it's always there for me if I need it. But I use it much less than I used to because of what I'm taking photos of these days. And that's my lenses. That's it. I've got 3 lenses. I use one of them 95% of the time, possibly more. So when you're faced with this massive range of lenses, just think about what's going to work for you. And it helps you narrow things down massively. One lens, 95% of my photos. How good is that?